London in the 1600s was the heart of a rising global power. With a population that swelled from around 200,000 at the century's start to nearly 575,000 by its end. This was a city of constant change, danger, and ambition. It was also a city caught between two worlds, medieval past and modern future, where half-timbered houses stood beside new brick mansions, and horse-drawn carts competed with the first stirrings of organized commerce. In this video, I'm using modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, engravings, and prints to life. What you'll see isn't just a still image on a wall. I can shift the camera angle, move through the streets, zoom into crowds, and show you depth and perspective that the original artists never could capture. This technology lets us step into these scenes in a way that's never been possible before. We're not just looking at history, we're walking through it. First, I want to talk about the most iconic structure in all of London, the bridge that connected the city to itself. This view shows London Bridge as it dominated the early 1600s, the only bridge crossing the Thames, and arguably the most important piece of infrastructure in England. The bridge was ancient, built by the Romans nearly 1500 years earlier, but by this era it had been completely rebuilt in stone, and it was unlike anything else in the city. The structure was so narrow, barely 30 feet wide, that it felt almost like a fortress. On both sides rose a canyon of buildings, 4 and 5 stories tall, their upper floors overhanging the street below like they might collapse at any moment. This view shows the foreground packed with carts and horses. The bridge itself thrummed with constant motion. Merchants pushed barrows, servants carried baskets, and wealthy merchants in dark wool walked beneath the shadow of these tall buildings. The smell would have been overwhelming. River mud, animal waste, spilled goods, and the press of hundreds of bodies. Above, between the buildings, you could barely see the sky. What made this bridge truly dangerous was the water below. The Thames at this point was still essentially a tidal river, and the bridge's 19 stone arches created what we might call natural dams. The current through these narrow gaps was ferocious, especially at high tide. In winter, the water would slow, and sometimes, in the coldest years, the Thames would freeze solid enough for frost fairs to be held on the ice itself. But in normal times, the water rushed beneath with enough force that even experienced watermen feared it. The bridge served as more than just a crossing. It was London's economic pulse. Beneath the buildings, in the space between the arches, lived some of the poorest people in the city. Beggars, widows, and apprentices crowded into damp, freezing rooms. Yet the rents from these spaces, and from the shops and offices above, made the bridge's ownership incredibly valuable. By the early 1600s, the bridge was already beginning to show its age. The buildings sagged, water seeped through the stone, and every few years there was talk of rebuilding it entirely. This remained true until 1666, when the Great Fire would change everything. But we'll return to that story later. For now, know that London Bridge was the lifeline of the city. Without it, there would be no London as we knew it. Remarkably, you can still visit the site of Old London Bridge today. The current London Bridge, built in 1973, stands very near the original location, though nothing remains of the medieval structure. But if you walk along the Thames path on the south bank, you're walking roughly where the watermen once pushed their small boats between those deadly arches. This view shows St. Paul's Cathedral as it stood in the early 1600s, a structure so immense that its spire had once been the tallest thing in all of London. Soaring 489 feet into the sky, the cathedral dominated the skyline. Its Gothic nave was longer than a football field, and the interior was filled with such darkness and shadow that even at midday, candles flickered inside. This was a building designed to make human beings feel small. By the 1600s, the cathedral was nearly 400 years old, built after a massive fire had destroyed the previous church on this site in 1087, but it was showing its age. The roof leaked, the stonework crumbled, and the interior had become something quite different from what the medieval architects intended. This view shows the inside during a busy morning. The floor was packed with people, And I mean packed. St. Paul's wasn't just a place of worship, it was a marketplace, a social hub, a meeting place. Lawyers conducted business in the side aisles. Merchants made deals. Young people gathered to show off their fashionable clothes. Beggars lined the nave. The sound would have been deafening, footsteps echoing off stone, voices calling out, the shuffle of movement. The smell of incense mixed with unwashed bodies, mud and animal waste tracked in from the streets outside. The cathedral's nave became known as Paul's Walk, and it was essentially the social media of its day. If you wanted to know what was happening in London, you came to Paul's Walk. If you wanted to be seen, to show off, to make connections, this was where you did it. The clergy complained constantly about the irreverence. There were rules against dogs in the cathedral, against merchants loudly hawking their goods, against the general chaos. None of it worked. The cathedral also served a darker purpose. In the crypt below, thousands of bodies lay buried, stacked in tombs and vaults. During plague years, and there were many in the 1600s, the crypt period, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth. The Globe was where these plays were first performed, where audiences gasped and laughed and saw themselves reflected in the actions of kings and commoners. But the Globe was not a safe building. It was constructed of wood, with a thatched roof. In June 1613, during a performance of Henry VIII, theatrical cannons went wrong. Fire spread rapidly through the thatch. The building burned to the ground in less than an hour. Miraculously, no one was killed. Audiences escaped through the exits, but the loss was total. The Globe was rebuilt, but with a tile roof instead of thatch. That second Globe lasted until 1644, when the Puritan government ordered all theatres closed. Today, a replica of the Globe Theatre stands on the South Bank, very near where the original once stood. If you visit it, you can experience something close to what a 1600s audience would have felt. The smell of the crowd, the sound bouncing off wooden walls, the sense of danger and excitement mixed together. It's one of the most authentically recreated spaces in London. This view shows Cheapside, the great market street at the heart of London. And by market, I mean chaos. Cheapside wasn't a single marketplace with boundaries. It was a street where nearly every inch was claimed by vendors, merchants, traders and hustlers. The view shows buildings 4 and 5 stories tall leaning inward, their upper floors overhanging the street so severely that in the middle of the day, the street remained in shadow. The foreground is jammed with stalls and people. The sound would be overwhelming. Thousands of voices calling prices, haggling, cursing, laughing. Every kind of good was sold here. Silks from the Orient, spices from the Indies, cloth from the Flemish towns, fresh meat from Smithfield, fish from the coast, leather goods, ironwork, books, medicines, jewelry. The smell was a mixture of everything: cooking meat, spices, leather, dyes, fresh blood, urine and unwashed bodies. This view shows the heterogeneity of 1600s London society. Wealthy merchants in fine wool and linen moved through the crowd. Apprentices in leather aprons carried goods. Servants bought items for their masters and mistresses. Beggars worked the edges. Pickpockets worked the crowds. Sex workers solicited from doorways. Children ran underfoot. It was a society compressed into a single street, all mixed together in a way that would be unimaginable in modern cities. The danger here was constant and multifaceted. Pickpocketing was rampant. Fraud was commonplace. Goods sold that weren't what they claimed to be. The crowds themselves were dangerous. Easy to get crushed, to lose a child, to be pushed into a stall. And disease hung over everything. Plague outbreaks were common. In 1603, a particularly severe plague killed perhaps 25,000 people in London, about 10% of the population. The plague returned again and again throughout the century. Cheapside was also where you could see the cutting edge of 1600s commerce. The rise of joint stock companies, the expansion of trade networks, the development of credit and accounting practices, all of this was centered in Cheapside. London was becoming a global trading hub, and Cheapside was where that transformation was most visible. By the 1660s, Cheapside had become even more crowded, even more chaotic. The Great Fire of 1666 would destroy it entirely. Afterwards, it was rebuilt wider, cleaner, with more space. But the old Cheapside, jammed, shadowed, overflowing, is gone forever. Today, you can walk down Cheapside. Modern shops line the street now, but if you look carefully, you can still see some buildings that date to the medieval period, still see the shape of the old street, still imagine the chaos that once filled this space. This view shows the Tower of London, viewed from across the moat, a fortress that had stood for nearly 600 years by the 1600s, originally built by William the Conqueror in 1066. The Tower was a place that inspired fear. Its massive stone walls, its towers, its moat, its guards. All of it communicated power, control, and danger. The tower served multiple purposes. It was a fortress, defending the eastern approach to London. It was a royal residence, though by the 1600s, most monarchs preferred Whitehall. It was a prison, holding both common criminals and state prisoners of the highest importance. And it was a place of execution. This view shows the foreground with the moat, dark and still, filled with water that was more sewage than water. Beyond, the massive stone walls of the outer circuit. And inside, visible in the midground, the White Tower, the oldest and most iconic building within the complex, built by William the Conqueror himself. By the 1600s, the tower held specific prisoners that reveal the political tumult of the age. In 1603, Sir Walter Raleigh, the explorer and favourite of Elizabeth I, was imprisoned here on charges of treason. He spent 13 years in the tower before being executed in 1618. Sir Thomas More had been imprisoned here in the 1530s before his execution. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, was held here before her execution in 1554. The tower was where the state kept its enemies. The tower also held the crown jewels, protected by guards and locked in a vault. These weren't just objects of value, they were symbols of legitimate monarchy, and protecting them was a state priority. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, the tower changed hands multiple times, and the jewels were in constant danger of being lost or melted down. Executions happened regularly at the tower. Nobility were usually beheaded on Tower Green, inside the walls, away from public view. The scaffold was a simple structure, often reused. The executioner's job was considered skilled work. A clumsy execution was an embarrassment. The severed heads of particularly important prisoners were sometimes displayed on pikes above the gates, a grim warning. The tower was rebuilt and modified throughout the 1600s. New defences were added to make it resistant to artillery. The buildings inside were expanded, but its essential character, fortress and prison, remained constant. Today, the Tower of London stands as a major tourist attraction, preserved and restored. You can walk the same paths that prisoners walked 400 years ago. You can see the cells, the execution sites, the crown jewels themselves. It's one of the most historically intact sites in London, and walking through it gives you a visceral sense of the power structures that defined the 1600s. This view shows Whitehall Palace, stretching along the Thames for more than a quarter mile, the primary royal residence of the Stuart kings who ruled England during this period. The palace was built originally by Cardinal Wolsey in the 1510s, then seized by Henry VIII. By the 1600s, under James I and Charles I, it had become the symbolic and practical centre of royal power in England. The view shows an enormous complex of buildings, courtyards, gardens and defensive structures. The foreground shows the river approach, where royal barges would arrive. The midground shows the main buildings, a mix of Tudor brick and more modern stone construction. The architecture itself was a statement. This was wealth, power and permanence. Inside Whitehall, the daily life was extraordinary. Hundreds of courtiers, servants, officials and hangers-on lived within the palace complex. The hierarchy was rigid and visible in everything. Who could eat in which room? Who could enter which courtyard? Who could speak to the king? Every action, every movement was choreographed and observed. The Spanish ambassador reported on who was rising or falling in royal favor. The French ambassador sent reports home, analyzing royal politics. The entire court functioned as a system of power relationships. The political tension inside Whitehall during the 1600s was immense. James I, who reigned from 1603 to 1625, was a Scottish king inheriting the English throne. He was learned, but he was also viewed as odd and effeminate by English courtiers. His son, Charles I, who reigned from 1625 to 1649, married a Catholic princess, a deeply divisive act. The relationship between the Crown and Parliament deteriorated throughout the 1630s and 1640s. In January 1649, Charles I was executed outside Whitehall Palace, beheaded before a large crowd. This was a shocking event, the execution of a king on charges of treason against Parliament. For a brief period, England had no monarchy. Whitehall Palace was stripped of its treasures, some sold, some destroyed. The regicide, the killing of a king, was a moment that defined the century. The royal apartments themselves were filled with luxury. The walls were covered with paintings. The furniture was imported from the continent. The gardens were among the finest in Europe. But this luxury was built on taxation, on the seizure of lands, on the manipulation of the people. And the tension between royal extravagance and popular resentment was one of the central political facts of the 1600s. Whitehall Palace burned down in 1698, destroyed by a fire that started in a laundry room. Only the banqueting house, built by Inigo Jones in the 1620s, survives today. You can still visit it and see where monarchs received ambassadors, and where Charles I walked to his execution. The memory of Whitehall's power is still visible in the buildings that surround it: the Horse Guards Parade, the Treasury, the Foreign Office, all built on the site of the old palace. This view shows something most tourists never think about: the Fleet River as it flowed through London in the 1600s. By this period, it was barely a river anymore. It had become an open sewer, jammed with rubbish, human waste, and industrial refuse. The smell would have been appalling. Along the banks of the Fleet stood Fleet Prison, one of the most notorious jails in London. The building was decrepit, damp, cold, filled with disease. By the 1600s, it held both serious criminals and debtors who couldn't pay their obligations. The distinction was important. Common criminals might be executed or transported, but debtors could theoretically be released if someone paid their debt, which meant they could spend years, even decades, in prison waiting for someone to pay. This view shows the prison from the outside, a forbidding stone building with barred windows. Inside, the conditions were hellish. The cells were crowded, often with 6 or 8 people sharing a space smaller than a modern bedroom. There was no sanitation. Disease spread rapidly. Prisoners who had money could pay for slightly better conditions: a single room instead of a shared cell, a window instead of a dark interior. Those without money lived in the darkest, foulest parts of the building. The keeper of Fleet Prison, like keepers of other prisons, made a profit from his position. Prisoners paid fees for everything: for entering, for being released from chains, for better food, for the privilege of being allowed outside occasionally. A prisoner could be financially ruined simply by spending time in prison, regardless of whether they had committed a crime. Disease was the constant killer in Fleet Prison. Jail fever, as it was called, probably typhus spread by lice, killed prisoners regularly. In the plague years, prisons became death traps. In 1665, the Great Plague spread through London, and prisons were among the hardest hit locations. Fleet Prison lost dozens of prisoners that year. The Fleet River itself, by the late 1600s, was recognized as a health hazard. The Great Fire of 1666 destroyed many of the buildings along the river, and in the reconstruction there was an attempt to clean up the river itself. But it was a losing battle. The river continued to fill with waste. Eventually, by the 1700s, it would be covered over entirely, hidden beneath streets and buildings. Today, the Fleet River is completely underground. You walk over it without knowing it's there. But if you go to the area near Farringdon Road, you can still trace its path. And the site where Fleet Prison stood is now near Ludgate Circus, marked by plaques and historical markers. But the prison itself is completely gone, erased as thoroughly as the river itself. This view shows Smithfield, the great livestock market at the northern edge of the city. Every day, thousands of cattle, sheep and pigs were brought here, driven through the streets from the surrounding countryside, and sold to butchers and merchants. The sight was overwhelming: animals packed together, the smell of manure and fear, the sound of bellowing and bleating. The foreground shows the muddy ground of the market, churned by hooves and feet into a slurry of waste. Merchants stood in groups, haggling over prices. Butchers' assistants guided animals into the killing pens. The noise would have been constant and deafening. Smithfield wasn't just a livestock market. It was also a site of public punishment and execution. Heretics and rebels were burned here. During the reign of Mary I in the 1550s, Protestant martyrs were executed at Smithfield in gruesome burnings. By the 1600s, it wasn't a primary execution site, but it was still used for particularly heinous punishments. The market was also a space where disease congregated. The concentration of animals, of butchers covered in blood and exposed wounds, of people in close proximity. It was a perfect medium for plague transmission. The smell of the market penetrated the entire area. Contemporary accounts describe the stench as overwhelming, even to noses of the era that were accustomed to much worse conditions than modern noses. This view shows the surrounding buildings, modest structures, many devoted to butchery, meat storage, and related trades. The neighborhood smelled of blood and death permanently, yet people lived here, worked here, raised families here. It was a neighborhood of tough people engaged in hard, dangerous work. By the 1660s, Smithfield had been in operation in roughly this form for centuries, but the Great Fire of 1666 would transform it, destroying many of the surrounding buildings and leading to a redesign of the market itself. After the fire, Smithfield was rebuilt with more space, with better drainage, with some attempt to create order out of the chaos. Today, Smithfield Market still operates, though now it handles primarily wholesale meat rather than live animals. You can visit it early in the morning when the market is most active. The smell is still pungent, the chaos still present. It's one of the oldest continuously operating markets in Europe, and walking through it gives you a sense of the unbroken continuity between the 1600s market And today, this view shows the Royal Exchange, built by Sir Thomas Gresham in the 1560s, as a covered marketplace where merchants could conduct business. By the 1600s, it had evolved into something more important, a place where the merchant class conducted international trade, where information was exchanged, where the financial future of England was negotiated. The view shows an ornate, multi-story building arranged around a central courtyard. The upper levels had galleries where merchants could display goods. The lower level and courtyard was where deals were made. The building itself was a statement of merchant power and prestige. This wasn't a makeshift market. This was permanent, organized, professional. Inside the exchange, you would find merchants from across Europe and beyond. English merchants trading with the Levantine Company, dealing in goods from the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean. Merchants of the East India Company, the joint stock company chartered in 1600 that would eventually make England one of the world's greatest powers. Merchants trading in woolens, in spices, in silks, in every kind of valuable good. The information flow in the exchange was critical. Before modern telecommunications, information moved only as fast as a ship could sail. Merchants in the exchange would gather news, what goods were profitable in which markets, what political changes affected trade routes, what rivals were attempting. The exchange was where fortunes were made and lost based on knowing first what everyone else would eventually know. By the 1600s, the East India Company was becoming central to English commerce. Founded in 1600 with a charter from Queen Elizabeth I, it represented a new form of commercial organization, a joint stock company where profits and risks were shared among investors. The company was essentially a state within a state, with its own military force, its own governance structure, and the authority to make treaties with foreign powers. Shares in the company were traded at the Royal Exchange. Investors became rich from the profits of trade with Asia. This view also shows the crowd in the exchange, merchants in fine clothing, clerks taking notes, servants waiting for instructions. The air would be thick with conversation, with the rustling of papers, with the smell of good cloth, of spices, of wealth. It's a scene of capitalist order, organized, purposeful, driven by profit and competition. The Royal Exchange was devastated in the Great Fire of 1666 and rebuilt. The new version, built by Edward German, was even more ornate, even more impressive. It became a symbol of London's recovery and resilience after the fire. Today, the site of the original Royal Exchange is a major financial district. The building itself is now used for other purposes, but you can still see its structure, still understand how it functioned. And walking through the space, you can imagine the conversations that shaped the British Empire itself. This view shows St. James's Park and the western expansion of London in the early 1600s. Originally a marshy hunting ground owned by the Crown, the park had been developed by Henry VIII into a formal royal space. By the early 1600s, under James I, it was being transformed into a fashionable destination, where the wealthy could display themselves. The foreground shows the manicured paths, the carefully planted trees, the controlled nature that characterized royal gardens. In the midground you can see wealthy people walking, nobles in their finest clothes, ladies with attendants, gentlemen on horses. It's a scene of leisure and display, a place where social status was visible and constantly negotiated. The view beyond the park shows the expansion of London toward the west. New houses were being built, new streets laid out, new neighborhoods developing for the wealthy merchant and professional classes. This was a different London from the medieval core around Cheapside and the Tower. This was planned, spacious, designed for people of means. The development of the western suburbs represented a fundamental shift in London's society. The medieval city was densely packed, mixed use, with wealthy and poor living in close proximity. The new western development was creating segregation, wealthy people moving to new, clean, orderly neighborhoods, while the poor remained in the crowded, disease-ridden core. This pattern would accelerate throughout the 1600s and beyond. The expansion was driven by both fashion and necessity. Fashion because the wealthy wanted to escape the crowds and smells of the old city. Necessity because the population was growing so rapidly that there wasn't room for everyone in the medieval core. Between 1600 and 1700, London's population grew from about 200,000 to about 575,000, nearly tripling. This enormous growth created pressure for expansion, for new housing, for new infrastructure. The western expansion also represented changing economic power. The medieval city's economy was based on trade, merchants controlling goods flowing through London. The new western suburbs were home to wealthy professionals, lawyers, doctors, government officials, whose wealth came from services and position rather than physical goods. The merchant class wasn't disappearing, but it was being joined by a new class of professionals. By the 1660s, the Western expansion had created entire new neighborhoods. Covent Garden, developed by Inigo Jones in the 1630s, was designed as a fashionable square surrounded by elegant townhouses. It represented a completely new way of thinking about urban space, planned, regular, designed for people of taste and means. The Great Fire of 1666 actually accelerated this Western movement, as wealthy people fled the burned core and invested in the less damaged Western areas. After the fire, the Western expansion continued even more rapidly. Today, St. James's Park survives, though it's been modified and modernized. You can still walk the same paths that Jacobean-era nobles walked. The park is one of the oldest continuously maintained green spaces in London, and it still functions as a place where the city's residents display themselves, though now in joggers rather than silk stockings. This view shows London on the morning of September 2nd, 1666. A fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, near the Tower. The fire itself wasn't unusual. London experienced small fires regularly. Buildings were mostly wooden, crowded together, with thatch roofs. Fire was an occupational hazard of living in this city. But on this September morning, conditions were catastrophic. The summer had been dry, the wind was strong and easterly, and the fire spread far faster than anyone had anticipated. By the time people realized the danger, it was already out of control. This view shows the fire advancing through the city. Flames consuming buildings on both sides of the street, the heat so intense that buildings 100 yards away spontaneously ignited from radiation alone. The smoke was thick and black, blocking out the sun. Contemporary accounts describe the roar of the fire as literally deafening. People on the street were overcome by heat and smoke. The social order broke down almost immediately. The normal firefighting methods, pulling down buildings to create fire breaks, were overwhelmed. The Lord Mayor tried to organize evacuations, but panic set in. People fled with whatever possessions they could carry, but many belongings were left behind. The streets became clogged with refugees trying to escape the advancing flames. The fire burned for 3 days. In that time, it consumed approximately 13,200 buildings, maybe 80% of the city. The medieval city of London, the London of Cheapside and Old St. Paul's, and the densely packed neighborhoods was essentially erased. Remarkably, death toll was surprisingly low, documented at around 16 deaths, though the number was almost certainly higher among the poor, whose deaths went unrecorded. The destruction was absolute. St. Paul's Cathedral was destroyed, its medieval stone walls cracked and weakened by the intense heat. The buildings along London Bridge were destroyed. Though the bridge structure itself survived, it would be rebuilt, though not for another 120 years. The Tower of London's wooden buildings were destroyed, though its stone keep survived. The Royal Exchange was destroyed, Smithfield Market was destroyed. Whitehall Palace was spared. It was located west of the fire's main path, but the entire landscape around it was transformed. The human aftermath was staggering. Tens of thousands of people were homeless. The winter of 1666 was brutal for refugees. Disease spread through the displaced population. Estimates suggest that the fire's secondary effects, cold, disease, starvation, may have killed as many people as would have been killed in a citywide plague outbreak. But the fire also created opportunity. Architects like Christopher Wren proposed completely replanning the city. Wider streets, more open spaces, better drainage. The medieval London, with its hidden alleys and dead ends, could be replaced with something more modern, more rational. The new London, rebuilt after the fire, would be different. The Great Fire didn't just destroy buildings, it transformed the city itself. Standing in the London of the 1600s, if we could somehow materialize there, we would be struck by how different it was from the city today, yet how recognizable. The same river, the same bridges, the same basic geography, but a city so crowded, so loud, so reeking, so chaotic. A city where disease killed indiscriminately, where power was visible and brutal, where enormous wealth coexisted with grinding poverty, often separated by just a few buildings. What strikes me most looking at these scenes with modern eyes is the sense of time passing. These buildings that seemed permanent and eternal have vanished. The people who built them, who lived in them, who died in them, they're gone completely. The only trace they leave is in the buildings themselves and the stories those buildings tell. And when those buildings burn, as so many of them did in 1666, it's as if those people never existed at all, and yet London endured. It rebuilt. The medieval city became a modern city. The Great Fire, catastrophic as it was, led to something better. And that resilience, that ability to survive disruption and rebuild, That's perhaps the greatest story the 1600s London has to tell us. If there's another London moment, another city, another era you'd like me to explore, let me know in the comments. I read every one of them, and your suggestions genuinely shape what I create next. Again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.